So, like, introduce yourselves and let me know, what role you played at Northgate during the time that you were there, and maybe how you first came across it. How did you first stumble across the project that's called Northgate in your career? And we'll just start with Peter, I guess.
Yeah, I was involved in Northgate both in the capacity of CEDO director, a position that I held from 1983 to 1989. And then when I was elected mayor in '89, through much of my life as mayor, I was involved in Northgate, including having the opportunity to see the project close and see the tenants buy the project. And I first became involved when, as CEDO director, I had the responsibility for housing initiatives in the city, and I was working for this guy called Bernie Sanders, and he says, Peter, you got to do something about Northgate. We got to save Northgate. I said, how are we going to do this? I said, I don't know, but make it happen. So we began this quest with these many partners, and we've only got a few of them at this table today. There were at least a dozen more with some very engaged residents. And off we went, and it's an incredible journey. Some of it's a little foggy in my mind, but I get excited when I think about the path
so your boss
that we walked.
Your boss was Sanders at the time. He came to you and said, make this happen.
Yeah, and I was close enough to the residents that I was hearing it directly from them, so I really didn't need to hear it from the mayor because I was hearing it from the residents. We got caught sleeping a little bit. We really weren't quite aware initially how vulnerable this place was in terms of being lost as an affordable housing asset.
When you say you aren't hearing from the residents, who else here was hearing from the residents or who had connections?
Well, I worked for Peter at CEDO,
Brenda,
and mine
yeah.
was the housing job. And so I was...
Say a little bit more about that. What were you doing?
Okay, when CEDO was created, they
Yeah.
created a housing director, community development director, economic development director, and mine was the housing job. And so when I started, I was told, go out and work with resident groups, tenant groups, neighborhood, and this was, the approach, work with Vermont Tenants Inc., so that was the approach of the city. And Northgate Tenants Association was one of the groups I was told to go and work with, and we were very aware then. That's what we were working on in the 80s, as Peter said. There are issues with, not being able to heat their places and the poor quality of the housing and high utility bills and so on, and so we were supporting them and organizing.
And this is one of the things which makes Burlington different. And this was a long time ago. This was 35 years ago now. But back then, and even today, many cities, they're butting their heads daily with tenant organizations and with resident groups. But we said, no, we can't do that. I mean, these are our constituents. These are the citizens of Burlington. We need to partner with them. We need to work with them. So that was the unique thing about our approach back then.
What was your personal, what did you bring to that?
Well, I also had a personal connection in that I had lived in one of the sister projects, Highgate Apartments, when I first came to Vermont as an immigrant. And I worked at a nursing home, and I lived at Highgate, which is even in worse condition than Northgate, owned by the same people. My apartment flooded, they did nothing. They were just horrible landlords, and I knew it. And I learned housing organizing in that city as a citizen. I was organizing on housing, and later went to work in community organizing. And when Bernie got elected, I said, I'm moving to Burlington, because he advocated to work with working people, tenants. Seemed like the right place, so I was very lucky to get to work there. And then I was very happy to get to work with the Northgate residents.
Great, we'll hear more about it. Gus, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, so I'm Gus Seelig, and I have a couple different roles in this, but primarily through the Housing and Conservation Board and the Housing and Conservation Coalition, where I've worked since it was created in 1987, in part, and in large part, because people at the state level understood that Northgate was threatened because of the work that had been done locally. But before I took that job, I was working at a community action agency in central Vermont, and I knew well the problems at Highgate. And then there was a developer in the mid-'80s who prepaid mortgages on projects he owned in Essex and in Moortown. And in one case, he doubled the rents, and everybody had to leave in Essex. It was 100 families. And in a different case in Moortown, he did condo conversion. And a legal aid attorney named Jim Libby was working on that case on behalf of the tenants. He got them the best settlement he could, but there was no way to stop the conversion. In the fall of 1986, a group came together to decide, could we organize a housing and conservation coalition? And the atmosphere then was that the federal government had basically retreated from housing and had retreated from conservation. And we found we had common interests, and at the heart of that was knowing that there were more things like Northgate ahead of us across the state. And Northgate, as Brenda was saying, was one of 4 projects developed by these out-of-state developers. Not necessarily well-built, certainly not energy efficient. Northgate, I think, had the most potential for conversion, not just needed to be fixed because it was in poor condition, but conversion to other uses that would have resulted in displacement of the community.
I guess wasn't it that same year, 1986, that Vermont's first tenant landlord law was put into place?
It was at about that time, and it did indeed, I think from a state perspective, a lot of the things that the Sanders administration in Burlington were doing to deal with the housing market, those problems were being seen in other places. A lot of churn in the market, a lot of flipping of properties and displacing people going on all over the state, and a real sense that people were being displaced from their communities. And that was a big reason. So it wasn't just were we going to lose a chunk of housing in one community, but were we going to lose affordable housing all over the state. And because the feds had, under Reagan, had really cut their housing commitment, there was a real sense that the state needed to step in and fill the vacuum. Mm-hmm. So in addition to after the coalition got going in '86, Governor Cunin, at the end of her campaign, actually pledged that she would support the creation of this fund, and it became integral to the state's effort to support Northgate. The first grant we made actually was in July of '88, and that was $28,000 to the nonprofit, just so that it could have the money it needed to build the capacity and structure the deal. And then in March of '89, we committed $2.9 million toward the buyout. And then in December, there was something that changed at the last minute, and we added another $150,000. So that was the state's part of trying to get the deal done, was to make that financial commitment.
The fact that you remember those dates and numbers is interesting to me.
Well, I looked up some of the dates before I got here today.
We all cheated.
But the numbers, the $3 million commitment to Northgate was pretty critical. And there's a Burlington legislator, everybody around the table knows the local stuff way better than I do. But as we were moving the legislation, and at that point to create the trust fund through, we talked with a legislator from Burlington named Carmel Babcock, considered to be a pretty conservative Democrat, but on the Appropriations Committee. And Northgate was part of her district. And we said, you know, there's not going to be quite enough money. And she disappeared for about 12 hours. And when the committee reconvened just before they finished the budget, she added $1 million to the trust fund. I don't know quite how she made the deal, or found the money, but it was in part because she understood, and she got the committee to understand, that there was going to be a big ask coming from her district that was going to be critical. And I guess the other thing important to say about doing this deal is it led to the reinvestment and buyout of the other 3 gates in Vermont. So this was a 336-unit deal, but then there were another more than 300 units in Bennington, Brattleboro, and Barre that all over the next 3 or 4 years were purchased and rehabilitated.
And are those resident owned as well?
Westgate in Brattleboro is the most successful, and they're just in the midst of a reconstruction that, in partnership with the Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, will be resident controlled. The other 2 projects are much more managed as traditional multifamily affordable housing without the same level of resident involvement. That doesn't mean that won't happen eventually, but I think from the perspective of resident control, Northgate and Westgate have been the two most successful.
I'm Mike McNamara. At the time, I was director of the Burlington Housing Authority. I came there in June of 1985, and on my very first week on the job, Brenda Torpy called me to say, you need to come with me to a press conference at Indian Brook. They're going to be closing 100 units at Indian Brook, and
Indian Brook's located in Essex.
Essex. Yeah. And so that was my introduction to what was to come, because that sort of set the stage that when Northgate came to the forefront, that we knew it was going to be a big battle. The first meeting I can see that I was at was in March of 1986 when CEDO developed the Northgate Task Force, which was really, it was the cast of Ben-Hur in affordable housing in Burlington and in Vermont. And I think we, in short order, in about 2 or 3 or 4 meetings, we came to the conclusion that there was no one entity that already existed that could take this project on. I was at the Housing Authority. We had our own troubles back in those days, and I think the other nonprofits involved just saw it as it would be too consuming for them. They didn't have the capacity to do it. So even while we used to joke back then about a nonprofit for every unit, we actually did come up with another nonprofit, and that it turned out that was the right model to go with. And I think because of the success of Northgate, I think the other thing it proved to all of us was that we could probably do almost anything. If we can do this, we can do almost anything.
Yeah, I mean, when we review the tapes and the documents, the number of parties that are involved is astounding.
Yeah.
Who was on that task force? Do you remember?
Oh, Sarah Carpenter, Alan Hunt, everybody here.
They represented the Vermont Housing Finance Agency,
Lake Champlain Housing
Vermont
Development
Housing
Corporation.
Authority.
Oh,
Local
folks from
nonprofits.
CVOEO on the,
Yep, Champlain Valley
Community
Office of
Development
Economic
Office, whatever it was called then.
And the residents
Beam,
were
a church
represented,
group.
right?
Vermont Legal Aid, Vermont Tenants Inc., Northgate Tenant
And we had
Association.
John Varsames was involved somehow.
And we had one
early.
developer to
Yeah.
be sort of give us the private development view. I used to say the problem with Northgate is everybody wants to save Northgate, and nobody can save Northgate. You had so many players at the table and a lot of competing interests in terms of how. Like, it was like everybody wanted to be, and they had a vision of how to do it, because these were big agencies.
Yeah.
Our nonprofits in the city, we were all too small to take it on.
And like Peter and Brenda, at the Housing Authority at the time, Bernie got control of my board, and that's what brought me in 1985. And when this came up, the board said, we want, we know we have our own problems, and you have to deal with those, but any time you can give to Northgate, we want you to do that.
Yeah.
So I was counting up all the meetings yesterday, and it's thousands of hours of meetings. And I was telling everybody before, the Free Press came out with an article once the deal was done, the women who saved Northgate, and it was Amy and Brenda and Amy and Anne Marie and Kara Lovejoy, who was my number 2 at the Housing Authority, read the article, and she looked at me, she said, where have you been going all this time?
Mike McNamara, unofficial woman of Northgate.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Michelle McNamara.
You had hair back then.
So do you. Somewhat.
No, we've touched on some of these, but in my mind, the lessons that we learned included one, that you need to have the political will, and it's not only the political will of the elected characters, but also the commitment and the will of the residents. And in Burlington, at a time when we were fighting like cats and dogs at the city council level, it's then called the Board of Aldermen, this was one of the few issues that they coalesced around, and Republicans, Independents, Progressives, Democrats supported the effort to save Northgate. But then that political will also needed to go to Montpelier and all the way down to Washington. We also needed partnerships, and as you can see, right from the get-go, the folks that were necessary to make this happen came together with the task force, and then those same entities were involved in contributions to the financing of it. We also needed the legal framework. I mean, good intention was not enough. You needed to adopt the landlord-tenant law. We needed to put in place both locally as well as the state level condominium conversion laws. You needed to create the Housing Conservation Trust Fund. So there's many moving pieces of this, and then you needed to mobilize the resources, which was not a simple task, but certainly the creation of the state's Housing Conservation Trust Fund was important. But at the end of the day, we recognize that the traditional housing programs were failures, and they were not working for anybody. In the traditional housing programs, the federal government would deeply subsidize private landlords and developers, and they would stay in a project for 20 years or so, and then they're out. And that housing stock is lost as affordable housing stock. Their pockets are filled with money, and there's a lot of federal subsidies that are just gone, lost forever. And so it was around that time that we began to design a new approach to housing, which included the notion of perpetual affordability, the creation of the Burlington Community Land Trust, and the notion that you need to lock in place these public subsidies. And there needed to be a long-term commitment to affordable housing, and we needed to make certain that it was for perpetuity, which was not a commonly held notion at that
Not
time.
at all. Yeah.
Does somebody want to just give us that? I mean, 1969 Northgate's built with federal dollars, and 20 years later, and this is the thing we haven't quite figured out. How was it discovered that in 1989, this is the buyback, right? This is,
Well, I think because of the sale and conversion of Indian Brook to market rate housing, which would have been about 85 or 86, it became clear, everybody began to look at what level of federal protection, if any, is there.
Yeah.
And we found that the answer
much.
was in the case of Indian Brook, none.
Yeah.
No notice at all. The guy just prepaid his mortgage. But for many of the HUD programs, once you'd fulfilled your 20-year contract, you could just opt out.
simplify that for me. 19, yeah, go ahead.
Say this,
Yeah.
because this always struck me as just shows you the inequality of how we spend money on housing in this country. The developer gets a 40-year mortgage, like 1% or something, to buy, and this land is very valuable, right? To buy the land, build the housing. He gets a soft rent control but at 20 years he can prepay that mortgage. So imagine if
You can just buy it all out.
And then he owns it.
And he owns it, yeah.
So, it's such a low interest mortgage, but at 20 years, he has no more obligations. He can sell it. All the wealth of that property goes to him. Imagine if the residents there got 40 or 1% mortgages. They'd all be owners. Yeah. This is the way we thought in Burlington. Yeah. The principles that created the community land trust were carried into the principles creating Northgate. It was not just permanent affordability, but the community control. You see, the residents control Northgate. There was a very strong commitment that not only would we not let the money go out of these programs, but we also wouldn't let the power of that home, go with somebody else who didn't need it. He was going to take the profits of that. He was a ski resort developer. He was on some of the powerful commissions, one of the owners, and he was going to create a world-class golf course with his profits of condominiumizing this. That's what he held that property for 20 years, not for housing, not for its purpose of housing. So that's what was
Bernie
accomplished.
said. No, you're not.
No, you're not.
No,
you
you're not.
won't.
And
no. He just said no.
We can work with you to come forth with a creative strategy that will allow this to remain an affordable housing asset, or we can fight. But we're not going to let 331 units? 336 units of affordable housing, the largest affordable housing project in the state. We're not going to lose it to fancy condos, which is what would have happened. It's a great location on the shores of Lake Champlain. Yeah. The landlord invested very little money in it in terms of maintenance during the life of the property, but he could have flipped it, invested money at last in order to create expensive condos, and would have been gone forever as part of Burlington's affordable housing stock.
how does that affect, like, would this happen today?
It would happen probably in Burlington today, but only because of this legacy. And in Vermont, I think we have managed. You don't make these gains of these policies and they just last. We were just talking about this last night at Northgate. It's because because these folks are empowered, and we have citizens who are empowered in the organizations who will go out and fight whenever people try to take away inclusionary zoning or take away permanent affordability. And so in Vermont today, there's a very, very strong ethic of, if you're going to invest in affordable housing, a lot of people think, well, we should do it this way so that the value is there. So for example, there's a big new development going on the shores of Lake Champlain, Cambrian Rise. Because of inclusionary zoning, 25% of those homes have to be affordable. But that developer, instead of fighting that, like people do in a lot of places around the country, he says, how do I make this work with the nonprofit sector? How do I make that happen? And people expect that now, and a lot of housing development would not be supported by citizens if they didn't see that's there. So there is a lasting effect, but you can never not nurture it, or people just don't know where that value came from. But things like this project, Keeping the History Alive, is one of the important parts of keeping that value.
So you have a combination of laws in place at both the local level and the state level that will protect the affordable housing. You have in place an affordable housing infrastructure with organizations such as the Champlain Housing Trust, but others as well, with support from the state that can manage and construct these affordable housing complexes. And you also have a sophisticated citizenry that's going to raise holy hell if their housing is threatened.
So across the state, we've probably invested, we've invested in 12,500 homes. That includes Northgate. That was the single largest real estate deal we've ever done, residential deal. But I think it gave everybody, as Mike said earlier, the confidence that anything is possible. We can make any deal happen. But the other thing we set out to do, and it was in the statute originally, was to build the capacity of communities to take these problems on. So there's probably in total more than 2,000 apartments around the state that had similar kinds of restrictions or lack of restrictions that Northgate did, but that we'd all invested in through our federal taxes, that could have been converted or were in really rugged shape at the time their contracts were coming to an end, that have all been protected and seen reinvestment, along with building thousands of new units all around Vermont. And in a lot of communities taking on the biggest, most rugged community development challenges whenever they've occurred. So one of the things that Northgate led to was an investment in organizations like CHT, which in the mid-90s took on the block across from City Hall after a terrible
Champlain
fire.
Housing Trust. Yeah.
Champlain Housing.
And we had a big argument at the state level about should we invest in that or not. And one person I remember argued, well, we don't need to do that because the market will take care of it. My argument was, yeah, the market will take care of it, and poor people of modest means will never live in that housing again. Now, the housing was not of good quality before the fire. It's of good quality now. But building that capacity around the state, similar situation in Brattleboro and Springfield and many other communities, where the notions that Peter was talking about permanent affordability, keeping displacement from happening in communities has been repeated over and over again. And every time there's a success, it leads people to think, okay, we can tackle this again in another community.
Yeah.
I think Vermont was way ahead of almost every other state in the country on preservation of existing HUD housing, and it was really Indian Brook, but then Northgate. Having saved Northgate, we realized whatever else is out there, we need to look at that first, because we don't want to lose 100 units and then have to build 100. Let's keep everything we have in the inventory and move on. And there are other states that are still fighting with this, and they look at us and they say, how'd Vermont get so far ahead on this? And it was that we got in early.
I was going to ask a related question. So has the Northgate experience had an influence on affordable housing projects in other states?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right from the get-go, it became a case study. And one of the reasons was Congress passed a law in 1990 for preservation, because this was happening now around the country. And there was California, big state, lots rural, had a powerful senator on the right committee who said, ooh, we're going to lose all our affordable rental housing, Cranston. And so they passed this legislation, but of course HUD did not want to implement it. HUD had been working for 20 years with these developers. These were their allies in the, that they worked with, and did not want to upset that apple cart. So when we started, we were naive and thought, well, there's a new law and we'll be the first in and we'll call HUD. HUD would not return our calls, it would not. So every time I needed, at this point I'd gone to work for this project, HUD to call us back, we had to call our senator's office. He had a powerful seat, even then, Senator Leahy for housing. And he would get them to call us back. And we talked about this strategy. We're like, what else are we going to do?
He was on the appropriations committee.
He was on approach. Thank you.
If they wanted his money,
Yep. So
they needed to respond.
Yeah, so he would sponsor these meetings for us at HUD. So it jump-started so we had this implementation model for their law. They hadn't published regs, and so it got written up nationally. And our renters here at Northgate have gone to national meetings where they're a model for other buyouts. Because the other thing that was unique here again was the commitment to the resident leadership. There's one thing, people want to save the projects, but they're like, we'll save it for those people. But in Burlington, it was work with, and those folks were at the table. And that's one thing that Burlington really preserved through the deal, even when it got tough. And so that inspired a lot of organizations around the country. And then more broadly, Burlington's been a model on permanent affordability, and the state, as has the state of Vermont. And now around the country, increasingly, cities and communities and local groups are looking to exactly these models. Because it's the only cost-effective way to do affordable housing.
One other important player, and there are probably many that should be mentioned in terms of Northgate, was a newly created nonprofit called Housing Vermont. And Brenda had a short tenure at the Housing Finance Agency, working with Alan Hunt and Mike Richardson on the creation of that nonprofit to utilize this very arcane tool called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit that had not existed prior to 1986, and that brought in a lot of private investment to help fund Northgate. But the importance of Housing Vermont here can't be understated, because in developing their mission, the idea was that they would work statewide and partner with locals, and they've done that repeatedly. So that's been another way that we've extended the capacity of the state without having to reinvent this highly technical expertise in every corner of the state to use this complicated financing tool. And the Housing Finance Agency gets a lot of credit for having stepped up. They actually endowed the nonprofit with a couple $1 million from their reserves to get it started. So, when we're talking about everybody being in to save Northgate, that meant that this quasi-public entity that didn't have to put any money on the table actually did in a big way to help create a nonprofit that could be a key partner in the original deal.
Yeah.
So this saga of Northgate began more than 30 years ago. We actually closed on the property, 28 years?
89 and 90.
28 years ago this month, or next month. What's going on today? The tenants are no longer the tenants, but they're the owners, right?
Yes.
And the managers.
Yes, at the end of this, the tax credit investment required a complicated structure where you couldn't have one entity own it. So residents were part of that, but it was structured from the beginning again so that at this point where finally we're free of those restrictions, the residents could purchase it through nonprofit. And they did create, with the support again of these same players, the city and HCB and so on, a Northgate Resident Ownership Corporation. And this is a single-purpose nonprofit, owns Northgate, that has a majority of residents of Northgate on the board, and by their choice, they chose to have some community reps on it, just to help, have that external part. But they do it, and they supervise the management company, which works for NROC, and this management company that specializes in working for resident owners, so they do it right. And it's just fantastic. That board, I was at a meeting last night. I love going to those board meetings because it's why we do this, And these folks now, a generation later, I've met the kids of the people who did this, and there's leadership there, and there's There's so much capacity, and so they continue. They just went down to Westgate and they went down to Highgate to help those organizations going through their process. And just as your agency said to you, you can go help this project even though it's not ours, the board there, even though they're all residents concerned about their homes and budget, they're like, yeah, you should help those other tenants. It's great. They also go down every year to advocate for the funds in the state trust fund, which we have to go to the legislature for every year. And they're very committed, not just to their own, but to this bigger mission.
And the psyche is a bit different.
The
right?
psyche's different. I mean, they're
it's-
owners.
There was a stigma of living in Northgate. Now it's viewed as a very desirable place to live,
Yeah.
as I understand it.
They are, and at this opportunity to buy it, they looked at all these options. Could they make them affordable condos? Could they make it into something else? And they made this decision very consciously. One, if they condominiumized, no matter how we did it, some people would not be able to afford that. So their main commitment was the affordability and security of everyone there. But then they also said, you know, we have a unique thing here. There's no rental housing. There's not enough rental housing in our community. And there's no rental housing where residents have what we have, which is this security and control. So they embrace this sort of hybrid they have of being owners and being in charge, but still providing rental housing. It was a very interesting discussion to listen to in all my years in housing and all the different models we've created. I would not have thought that up, you know? And they're like, this is an important piece that nobody else could do but us. And they fill that role. You could just apply and get an apartment, and then soon you'll be visited to say, you know, you have other rights here, and you can join the board, and it is a wonderful thing.
So why, I think the piece that is underlying is the idea that you don't just leave housing up to the market.
Yes.
And also, so maybe talk about that. Like, what's the underlying, why is it also important to have residents of Northgate living in the city?
Yeah.
And why don't we just let the market take its place, and then people will live wherever they can tend to live? And why is that?
Well, one, it goes to what kind of community do you want to have? Do you want to have a community that is, if not gated, with a gate, is economically gated? Or do you want to have a community that's inclusive and has places where not just doctors or lawyers can live, or nurses, but nurses' aides, and not just librarians, but the aides in the schools? And so are you going to make room for everybody is a big piece of what I think we're all after. There have been some reports done nationally about one called a heavy load. And what happens to low-income people across the country is they get moved further and further away from places of employment, and they end up living in cheap housing, and they have long commutes, and then they have big transportation expenses. So when you look at their quality of life, it's compromised sometimes not by their high housing costs, but the combination of their housing cost and their commuting cost,
And time.
and the time that they lose. You know, what does it do to an employer when you have somebody who doesn't make a lot of money, and their kids are in school an hour away from where they work, an hour and a half away, which you'd find in California or the Boston area all the time, and all of a sudden they get a call from school and they need to leave work. So the notion of having an inclusive community, I think, was at the heart of what Peter and Brenda and Michael were all working in this community about, and I think that what Vermonters have always cared about. And again, it goes to the issue of we don't want to displace people from the communities that they work in and live in and grew up in just as a matter of economics.
Yeah. Since I'm out of office, political office, I can get political for a moment. Is that okay?
Oh, please. Yeah.
So
Don't look at me.
we live at a time when many people are working very hard to dismantle government.
Yes.
And the approach to this project, and it continues to be an approach that is embraced in Burlington, is that government can make a very positive difference in people's life, including providing a safe, decent, affordable place for people to live. But it can't be government alone. It needs to be government working in partnership with engaged citizens and with the very important nonprofit sector. And I think that it's that notion that government can bring positive changes to people's lives, which kind of drove this project 35 years ago and continues to be the spirit of Northgate, but so much else that's happening in this community today.
Who's missing at the table? Who should be
Oh.
sitting here at the table?
You would need
a
a very,
cast of-
you would need a very, very long table.
There were other folks who worked for the city who worked at this along the way because it was multi-year, as you saw, evolution, and people like Amy Wright who worked at CEDO and John Davis, who's a genius about all of this housing policy, but did very hands-on, created the funding for Northgate Nonprofit that started that, brought the players to the table. As you said, the big role of Housing Vermont and Vermont Housing Finance Agency, the folks at the time, really incredible.
And the notion to create this trust fund that had the dual mission
Yeah.
of conservation and housing, kind of a brilliant notion, creating a new coalition in the leadership that Madeline Cunin provided in creating the initial Housing Conservation Trust Fund, and so many legislators that supported the adequate funding of the trust fund. And so many on the city council that over the years were able to
Yeah,
move
we're
beyond political differences that they had and come together united in terms of saving Northgate.
We often remember, Alan Gear, who was the alderman from that ward, and he was very conservative, especially didn't think government should interfere in real estate. So was not a fan of like our community land trust creation. But these folks were his constituents, and when he learned about what could happen to them, and he had a press conference with Bernie and said, we have to pass condo conversion to protect these residents. I think that started to shift a lot of thinking. A lot of people were very opposed to the land trust and those ideas of taking housing out of the market. They thought it was communistic, and of course, they're afraid of Bernie. And this is what started to shift it, was this, as you have said many times here, that Northgate, that could happen, and we really have to think about things differently. And he was very key to that. And later he went on that board, and he had such a strong sense of just what's right. And he would surprise us sometimes with having views we didn't think of as Republican, because it's about what's right. So he's one.
In the grassroots leadership, you
Yeah.
can't overstate the importance of it. And this never would have happened if the residents were not behind it. And early on, I remember such leaders as Anne Marie Dennis and Donna Russell. You know, they had a lot going on in their lives, but they made saving Northgate part of their lives. And it consumed a fair bit of time and energy. But they and many others, I forget the names now, I'm getting old.
Witter
But
and-
yeah.
Ortiz Wilson.
John Romeo, remember John
Yeah, of
Romeo?
course,
He came out of the labor movement. He was very strong. His widow now is on the board. Just very, very strong leadership there, and they were even like, they would push back on us, like, don't come and tell me you're the city and you're just trying to help us. You know, they were always testing that we were genuine about that, and that was fine.
Our congressional delegation was always right there,
Yeah.
solidly in support. Pat Leahy, because of seniority, but also because of his seat on the Appropriations Committee, was very helpful
And he had a-
over the years.
And he had a staffer who'd actually worked in housing in Vermont, John Romano, who I think
effective.
was very effective in helping us work through all of this. But I think the whole delegation was very supportive of the effort overall.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah, if you had a list of folks that played an important role in saving Northgate, it'd be a list of hundreds of people.
yeah,
I mean, really, who put their shoulder to the wheel. And I think that's what you say, that's a Vermont story. I mean, that is the sort of a sense of civic
But
obligation.
would it be easier to do now with all the things that?
well, you know, one of the things that's come out of the development of this nonprofit network and the sharing of this technical expertise is the ability not just to do preservation, but to build housing of all types all over this. So what happened this last year in the legislature is that our new governor, a Republican governor, said, we have fallen behind, and he went to the legislature and asked for a $35 million revenue bond to build more housing. So it's not the identical story, but I think there's been a recognition of our common purpose and the need to be finding ways to intervene in the marketplace, because we have a shortage of housing in many parts of the state, and we still have parts of the state that are economically struggling where there's a real need for reinvestment.
Mike, any final thoughts?
Well, I think the other piece of it is we had to approach HUD back then for funding. And we look back on it now, and then we would say, oh man, it's bad. You know, there's not a lot of funding. But I think when you ask the question, what would happen now? I mean, the funding picture is even more bleak, and that's why, I mean, it's important that the tax credits came along in 1986, and Vermont was one of the first to figure out through Housing Vermont how to utilize those, and this deal wouldn't have gone through without them.
Are they on the,
Yeah.
those tax credits, are they on the chopping block today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although they're probably saved in the Senate. But today, there's a sort of reverse, because today you have a lot of skill and will now in the community. When we started, not only had they created the tax credit program, and a lot of the HUD programs, they were ending, but there was still source there. But Vermont Legal Aid funded a legal project, which did a lot of the research and the work and the advocacy that we counted on statewide for landlord-tenant law and so on. Community action programs around the country have far more funding and could fund tenant associations and tenant support. And then there was more capital. Today, we have all this ability in the community, which is why it's important to keep it alive, but the capital is not there. The funding of the programs has been dried up. It's much harder to make something happen. So today, it would have to be done, and we would figure it out here, but I imagine it would have to be very different. But what's possible today and what's necessary is that with this will we've created, people have to advocate and change things back to where government is working for people. So it's the only choice we have.
Yeah, and I think that Northgate was the first one that we used. There were 11 funding sources. I can't name them all. But I think that was
That pie chart.
but that was sort of the first project. After that, it sort of became,
That's
okay,
what we do.
if we need 15, we'll find 15. You know.
Yes, yes, yeah.
So, do you look back and think that was fun?
Yes,
Yes.
it was fun.
The best kind of work to do,
Yeah, that was fun.
with lots of good people putting their shoulders to the wheel together.
But when we started this task, I don't know that many of us would have bet a week's paycheck that it would have been successful. It was, but the alternative was so daunting that we had to make it happen. But you know, this $21 million. This is 1989 money. It's a
That
lot of
wasn't
money.
just the biggest affordable project in Vermont or affordable deal. It was the biggest residential development in the state, and it was the biggest real estate deal to that point. And when I started with Northgate Nonprofit, we had a $60,000 grant, startup grant, to create it and to start raising money. I would not in my wildest dreams have imagined $21 million because, you know, I was never a finance person. I had, you know, it was just like spreadsheets, not me. But it didn't matter if it was 10 million or 21 million at a certain point. You know what I mean? It's like, this is just what it is. And at one point, we got the $3 million check from HUD to HUD Flex, or your $3 million check from VHCB. I was there with the person who was doing the books for us, Martha Abbott. And we were like, we walked this check to the bank. We're like, this is $3 million. Talk about laughing fun. We're like, this is $3 million. So, you know, we could not have imagined that amount of money.
Well, you told the story about Amy Wright and Tom Demery, who was FHA commissioner at that time. And I was at the Housing Authority one day, and a letter came from HUD from the FHA commissioner. Well, that's nothing you ever see in the public housing world. And I said, what the heck is this? This is crazy, because Amy was saying, oh, I got them locked up, 163 flex sub. It's going to be great. And I opened the letter, and there it was. Northgate will receive 163 flex subsidies. And
That's
it was just, it
rental
was sort of the way I looked at it was sort of proceed as the way opens, because, you know, pieces just kept coming into place, and the more the pieces came into place, the more pieces seemed to come on the horizon.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
timing is often very important. If this all had to happen 3 years earlier, then Peter's sense of, I'm not sure this can really happen, might have been, you know, it was late enough that tax reform had passed and created the tax credit, that Housing Vermont had gotten started, that the city had survived the initial very tough years of the Sanders administration, and Bernie was in a place to really be forceful about it, that people like Alan Gear got brought along. There were many that the state, 3 years earlier, the state wouldn't have had the financial capacity to create a trust fund. So we were fortunate, but we worked hard to keep building the blocks.
Maybe I have a rosy looking back, but I think those things weren't accidental. The work with the tenants started in '81, so
Right.
a lot of these things, like the trust funds here and the trust fund, the conservation fund, came out of the awareness that had been built about the need for it and the fight that people had to keep fighting for it year on year on year. That was from 1982, Northgate Tenants Association, and till 87 before we had, landlord-tenant law and some things. There was a lot of steady work by Vermont Legal Aid and around that. I just remember that built from a time where you're right, where there wasn't really support and people just thought we're crazy, to the point where it became, more commonly accepted.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to
Yeah, thanks.
reminisce
Joanne.
and to
Yeah,
get
thank
together
you.
with these
Rave.
folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for
Thank
coming
you.
in and
Thank
doing
you.
this. Yeah.